Now, here are your hosts, Dominick Tavella and Michael Hartzman.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman. Today is Tuesday, March 21st, and I'm on, as always, with my partner, Dominick Tavella. How are you this evening, Dom?
Doing great, Mike. Doing great. No complaints. How about yourself?
I'm well. No complaints here. I know you're still down south, but I don't want to make you jealous, but it was a beautiful 60 degrees today on Long Island.
Listen, is it officially spring? I think it is. I don't.
It is. As of yesterday.
Hey, that's a good start to springtime.
As of yesterday, spring has sprung, and hopefully we're out of the woods with the snow. We got very little snow, and baseball starts next week. So
and all we have to do is get through the Fed decision tomorrow.
Tomorrow at 2:00.
We'll see what happens.
You know, and again, my favorite quote will be deja vu all over again. We'll watch the number, and then we'll listen carefully to what Powell says, and the market will react to first what the number is, and then second to what Powell says, because that's what normally happens.
But think, Mike, just 1 week ago, we were doing this show, and we were literally looking at a potential catastrophe crisis in the banking system, not only here in the States, but Europe with what happened with Credit Suisse. And inside of a week, it went from potential calamity, world crisis, banking crisis, to, I dare say, maybe crisis averted.
You know, we talked about this morning in our morning call with our advisors. You know, what was Janet Yellen? What was her motive by saying we could backstop more banks if we have to? And I would dare say that, to your point, this story is 10 days old, and no other banks have come forward. The only other bank that was bubbling around was First Republic. And if you were a shareholder of First Republic, you've had a horrific 10 days. The stock, you know, I mean, I know it rallied today, but stock went from like $120 10 days ago to, I think it was 12 yesterday it closed. But if you're a depositor, you have to be breathing a little easier. And I do think the government, I think it was a team effort. I think the government did a good job of containing this crisis.
But Mike, and I want to think it was Freudian. I think you were right when you said 10 years in the making, not 10 days. This is clearly a policy that interest rates were excruciatingly low, money was excruciatingly cheap, and businesses, not just banks, made very bad decisions based on thinking, hey, I can borrow money at next to zero, limitless amount of money. And so a lot of this still, I think, does have to come out in the laundry, maybe not to the magnitude that we just saw this past week or two. But some of it, I think, is still out there. And maybe that's Yellen's kind of saying, hey, if another ugly situation were to arise that we're not aware of, we're in a position where we can deal with it.
And look, I must have gotten, since last Monday, 100 phone calls from clients who wanted to know if their money was safe, who wanted to know if the banking sector was collapsing, and wanted to know if their investments were collapsing, and so forth. All legitimate fears if you don't follow the stories as closely as we do. But the reality of it is, the story really started to percolate with Silicon Valley the Thursday before. And lo and behold, Dominic, from that point to now, we've done exactly a round trip, where on March 9th, before the story broke, the S&P was pretty much where it is right at this moment.
Yeah, look, and we did take a decent step back, and you can argue warranted, right, Mike? I mean, there was a lot of unclear issues at that time, or just a week ago. How would these situations were going to get resolved? Was the government going to step in? Were savings accounts and bank accounts in general going to be backstopped by the FDIC and the Fed? And of course, you know, we don't pay a lot of attention to it because we're here in the United States, but Credit Suisse collapsing, the second largest bank in Switzerland, was a big deal. That's a big deal. So look, we have a clearer picture today. We've seen the markets, I almost would call it a relief rally. But is that good news or bad news, Mike? Because we just kind of ended up where we started with pretty much the same issues that we were here in the first place.
Well, so let's talk about tomorrow then, because before March 9th, the general consensus for a couple of weeks was that the Feds really were determined to cool inflation down no matter what. The numbers we were getting were a little hot. Then the last CPI number gave us a little bit of a relief. But the betting money was on the Fed raising interest rates 0.5% prior to this banking crisis. And then the consensus was maybe they'll do 25, maybe they'll do nothing at all. We've heard a couple of very large financial institutions say that. My bet is they split the baby and they go 25 basis points tomorrow. And the market will look very closely to the language to see if Powell and the Fed take a break. And I think while Powell usually doesn't throw the market a bone, I think he will hopefully take that posture that there'll be a little more dovish. What do you think?
I think you're 100% correct, Mike. I think in the end, you're going to be 100% correct. But I just want to emphasize that maybe the markets have already done a lot of the heavy lifting for the Fed, because now banks are going to be constrained in being excruciatingly careful on the loans that they are making and whom they're making the loan to. By definition, if you're a business and you can't borrow money and you can't use it for expansion purposes or acquisition purposes, that slows economic growth, that slows inflation, maybe as a side effect of unintended consequence of what we just went through. The market did the Fed's job.
It did. And I think that's a good thing.
I think it'll help.
Yeah, me too. So, Dom, having an investment show, whenever we bring a guest on, we always want to be mindful, if they're not in our industry, what value do they bring as relates to our industry and how we make investment decisions. And tonight we have the author, Brittany Hodak, who wrote a book, Creating Superfans. And it's basically, how do companies build their brand, make the brand popular, make the brand a brand that most people could relate to, most people want to be a part of. And I would say, with the country more divided than ever, and the country sometimes, or the media sometimes, looking for a fight, I'm really interested to get Brittany's thoughts on how do large and small companies alike figure that out and try to get it right more often than not.
And Mike, you and I'm looking forward to this conversation this evening, but you and I many times will go, well, let's invest in that company. And you're like, well, why do you want to invest? Well, it's a great company. And you're like, well, have you looked at the balance sheet? Do they have good earnings? Do they have earnings growth? Do they pay a dividend? All of the wonderful stuff. Like, well, no, it's a great brand, right? So brand awareness and maintaining the quality of that brand and how you treat your employees, all this stuff is critically important to individual stocks, individual companies, and certainly the market. So this is going to be a great conversation tonight.
Yeah, and really, we both learned in college, Dom, that the value of a brand, there are ways to calculate it, but the value of a brand is sometimes the hardest part of a business to even put a value on.
And how many times have we seen it destroyed, right, Mike? Companies spend billions of dollars to create it, and advertising and marketing, and then an event happens that just completely destroys the brand. So looking forward to having Brittany give us some background on this and then get into some of the meat and potatoes.
So we'll be right back right after this break with Brittany Hodak, author of Creating Superfans.
Lebenthal.com. Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with my partner, Dominick Tavella, and our guest this evening, author and speaker, Brittany Hodak, author of the book, Creating Superfans. And Brittany, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Welcome, Brittany. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you.
So Dominick and I have a lot of questions, but before we get into them, talk a little bit about the book and what were your experiences that you were motivated to write the book in the first place?
Well, thank you for asking. The book is called Creating Superfans: How to Turn Your Customers into Lifelong Advocates. It came out in January, and it was the product of me spending probably 3 or 4 years to really try to think, how could I create a book that makes customer experience exciting? Because I'm a professional speaker, so I travel around, I talk to a lot of people. So many people told me, I haven't read a book since college, or I haven't read a book since high school, or I would never read a business book or a professional development book. So I wanted to really attack this challenge of how do you share wisdom in a book and make it accessible and fun for people who don't like to read? Because I think customer centricity and customer experience are critical for every single brand in the world to really put at the forefront of how they teach their employees. But it's, of course, hard to teach an employee if it's not fun and engaging. So I wanted to bring like a pop culture flair and some fun to this idea of what it means to be truly customer centric, so that every single employee, whether there's somebody there on their first day for an internship or the CEO, can really share a language around a customer first mindset.
Excellent. So my first question for you, and Dominick mentioned it on the open, companies spend billions of dollars and perhaps sometimes decades building a brand, and it could all go down the drain for, let's say, half the country in a minute, right? So what is the balancing act large and small companies have to have between taking a position on a social issue or something they think is important versus potentially alienating what seems to be now half of their customer base?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's something that, to your point, businesses small and large face this same concern and consideration. And, I think some of it is rooted in the fact that the world that we're living in today, of course, is very polarized, but is also very connected. It's never been easier for somebody's opinion, somebody's experience, somebody's review to travel around the world. And so many people think that their brand is their logo or the commercials that they run or the ad campaigns that they spend money on. And that is just no longer the case. Your brand is what your customers are saying about you to their friends and to strangers on the internet. It's every interaction that every single one of your employees has with a customer at any given moment. Every employee can be the chief experience officer in any given situation. So for brands to make the decision of how much they want to speak out or not speak out on social issues is something that's becoming, a really big deal at every level of the organization, because you have not only the customers to think about, but also the employees to say, is this a company that I feel aligned with? Is this a company whose values mirror mine? And of course, there are some categories in which you can get away with saying less, with being involved less, and others where you're going to be expected to say, this is what we believe, this is what we don't believe. And sometimes those might be, cultural issues, and sometimes they might be just sort of way of doing business issues, like where do we source our materials, and how comfortable are we with what we ask our employees to do, and the environment in which they work. So all of these things are important, and you're right, brands have to be thoughtful in how much they do or don't want to wade into those waters based on what their core identity as a brand actually is.
So, Brittany, piggybacking on what Mike asked you, we often, not often, but every once in a while, we get a question from one of our clients. Well, what does this have to do with the stock market, right?
Yeah.
But and how you treat your own employees and how you treat your customers can have just ginormous implications on the stock value, as we saw with a very famous company here in Florida not too long ago. I mean, we could see dramatic price changes in the valuation of companies just because they're found out to not treat their employees or their customers well, or maybe take a position that isn't popular.
Oh, absolutely. Or has a founder who sends a crazy message or any of those things. So to answer your question of what does it have to do with the stock market, there have been lots and lots of studies over the years that kind of look at the long-term stock price impact of customer experience leaders versus customer experience laggards. And one that comes to mind was done by Watermark Consulting a few years ago, where they looked at something like 15 years market performance of companies. And the customer experience leaders, so those who had a reputation as really treating both their employees and their customers well, not only had higher employee and customer retention, but on the S&P 500 500 outperformed the market by about 108 points. And those that were seen to be customer experience laggards, so they were, known for not treating their customers or their employees particularly well, were almost exactly the same on the other side. So they underperformed the baseline by about, I think it was like 115 points over a 15 or so year-long period. So
those are significant returns.
Significant returns. And, I've seen other studies over the years that show the performance over periods of decades, looking at the stock market. And there is always a correlation. And, it's one of those things where I think we've become so used to judging quote unquote performance of a company based on the quarterly reports, based on, the top line number at the end of the year instead of the bottom line, things like profit rather than retained customers and how much growth is coming from people coming back to you. And so prioritizing those short-term gains, even though it might be great for the stock price, it might be great for the CEO's bonus, oftentimes are not great for the customers. And you can see that in the performance of those companies over years and certainly over decades.
Brittany, how has a post-COVID world changed how people treat their brand and how mindful they are? Because what I'm thinking about is returning to work, returning to the office, right? There, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan and the head of Morgan Stanley, they went on the record very, very early on saying we expect eventually everybody to come back. And I had lunch today with someone else from a very, very large financial institution. And they said their CEO said the same thing. They expect everybody to come back. And there's pushback from employees. You mentioned employees earlier. So that affects the brand, right? Because it could be perceived that these CEOs or these gigantic companies are insensitive.
They're insensitive, or they're just apathetic, right? Or maybe they're not listening at all. And customers give companies their money, but employees give them their time, which is infinitely more valuable. And, when you think about any relationship in your life, you don't want to be in a relationship where you feel unappreciated or unheard. That's true of your personal relationships. And it's absolutely true of your professional relationships. Every employee wants to feel validated, wants to feel appreciated, wants to be in alignment with what their organization is all about and stands for. And I think a lot of companies, including Chase and Morgan Stanley, have made missteps when they've just come out with these blanket statements saying, everybody's got to come back. Also, some of those, I can't recall the timeline on the JP Morgan one, but I know several companies have fallen into the trap of they've said it to the press before they've said it to their teams. Mm-hmm. So a much worse way for an employee to find out that HR has made like a blanket rule without doing any employee listening or asking for any feedback in like a company-wide email is to find out about it in their Google alerts. So that's another example of, there are right and wrong ways to make decisions, and there are certainly right and wrong ways to message things, both internally and externally. And hey, let's let our employees find out about it in the news is pretty much 100% of the time the wrong way to do it.
And Brittany, I apologize because I haven't had an opportunity to read your book yet, but I think it's primarily focused to customer relations. But if you're not taking care of your employees, and if you don't have happy campers as employees, it's really difficult to get that message across them to the client, correct?
Oh, it's more than difficult. It's virtually impossible. Yeah. And so I do have an entire section in my book that's all around building super teams, because if you don't have advocates inside your company, you're never going to have them outside of your company. It is virtually impossible for an apathetic employee to create an engaged customer. So the first step is figuring out how to create alignment around your internal team so that everyone is clear on your brand, everyone is clear on what you're all about, what the level of expectations for service excellence is. Because honestly, if you're just looking, saying like, these are the people who are here to get a paycheck, you're never going to get it right. Like, you've got to treat your team as your most important resource, and you've got to help them elevate their experience with your brand from just a paycheck to minimally a passion and hopefully a purpose. And it's possible, regardless of what industry you're in, regardless of what problem you're solving, you absolutely can get people to understand that they are a part of a bigger, deeper meaning with their role at your organization. And if you don't do that, then your customers are very likely going to consider you in the commodity space, because they're going to feel what they get from their employees is very much like, oh, this is just another commodity. Maybe I should make a decision based on, the best price or the first person to call me back or the quickest location to drive to from my house or office or something like that.
So to that point, I kind of feel recently that every time I call a call center, I know I'm not talking to a robot yet. I know I'm talking to a human being, but they speak to their customers like robots. It's as if they have this pre-programmed script, and they cannot deviate from it. Even if you ask them how they are, it's almost as if they're short-circuiting, because no one asks how they're doing. And I kind of feel that, do call centers get the same amount of attention in dealing with customers as, say, face-to-face? Because quite frankly, maybe this is venting, I feel like the call service experience has been deteriorating over the years.
I love this question, Michael. I'm so glad you asked about this. So I think call centers historically have gotten a really bad rap. Business leaders look at them as cost centers. They say, oh, we've got to spend all of this money, for people just to help customers. And look at, what was it? Frontier Airlines that just did away with their call center entirely a few months ago, which also is a terrible decision. But because people have mistakenly looked at it as a cost center, it often gets outsourced, whether that's to a BPO, whether that's to an offshore company. But you have, again, people who are apathetic about your brand because they don't even feel like they're a part of it. They may not have been trained on your culture, on the things that are unique to you that set you apart from your competitors. They're just told to read a script. And, when customer says this, press F1. When they say this, press F2, then read the next sentence. And I think that is a huge mistake that businesses have made in this, sort of false sense of like, oh, this is an efficiency thing or this is a cost savings thing. But those call center employees or call center outsourced laborers are the representatives of your brand. They are the people who are going to help determine if somebody gives you another opportunity, if they come back and order from you again, or maybe if they order for the first time. So if you look at the customer experience leading organizations, almost all of them have their call centers internal. They're actually employees of the company, not 1099 partners, or 1099 partners run through a couple of different BPOs or organizations. And I think that's so important. And that's not to say you can't have success with your call center if you're outsourcing it. But if you do, you need to be very strategic, both with choosing your outsourced partner and also with the training and the instructions that are given to everyone representing your brand. Everyone has got to be made to feel that they are an important part of the mission, that they are representing this brand in a way that feels true and authentic to them, but also that matters for the customer.
Brittany, we're talking about call centers, but both myself and Mike have gotten significant clients with significant assets because they simply couldn't even get their phone call returned at other institutions. What's happened to that human interaction where one human being speaks to another human being where they can actually have a real life conversation?
It's crazy, right? It's so funny. One of the stories that I tell in my book is my oldest son, Cato, who's now 5.5, was about 3 when I was working on this particular part of the book. And I was trying to explain to him the concept of the book. And he said, "Mommy, what is your book about?" And it was the first time he asked. So I was trying to, tell him a little bit about customer experience and a way a 3-year-old would sort of hopefully understand. And after about 30 seconds, I could tell he was over it. So I was like, "What do you think, buddy?" And I fully expected him to say, "That is dumb. You should write about superheroes or trucks or dinosaurs or something." But he was really quiet for a second and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "Mommy, I think you should tell the people to be nice and listen." Wow. And then he just ran out of the room. And I was like, did my 3-year-old just write my book in 4 words? And you're right. None of this is difficult. It's all so simple. And yet people don't do it. And, I feel like we probably as humans, but like definitely as American humans, have a really good knack for overcomplicating things. Like we take something that should be very simple and we make it very hard. That's why there's like a bazillion different diet plans out there. It's like, pretty much the basics are there and we make things more complicated than they need to be. The same is true of customer experience and customer service. And you're right, Dominic, like sometimes it's as simple as picking up the phone or being kind or giving someone a compliment or actually, I don't know, living up to your promise, doing what you'll say, doing what you tell a customer that you'll do. So
and being empathetic that we're all going through difficult times or something difficult in their own personal lives. Or God forbid, bank failure, and there's a crisis out there, understanding that people will deal with and are dealing with stress.
Oh, absolutely. You cannot separate somebody as an employee from them as a human. And by wrongfully thinking you can compartmentalize it and only care about what happens in your employee's life from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day is a huge mistake. Maybe in the future when you have automated workforce, like you can do that. But for now, it's impossible to separate what happens to us from, 8 to 5 from 5 to 8.
Brittany, we are bumping up against a break and I have my next question teed up, but I don't want you to rush through the answer. So let's take a break and we'll be right back right after this.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominick Tavella and our guest this evening, Brittany Hodak, speaker and author of the book, Creating Superfans, How to Turn Your Customers into Lifelong Advocates. And Brittany, I'm sure there are many ways to turn customers into lifelong advocates, but my next grumpy old man soundbite is I feel like these large companies and small are turning people into lifelong frustrated ex-customers because they just make it very, very difficult to interact with them, especially on the internet. And you can't even find a phone number half the time to call. Either you have to email in a request or you have to talk to an AI chatbot, where I would just think it's more efficient if I got someone on the phone and had my problem resolved in 10 minutes rather than waiting 2 days to get an email returned.
Oh, 100%. And again, I think this is one of those things that we'll look back on this period in history and say, how foolish so many of those people were because they're making a decision to prioritize something that looks like it's going to save money in the short term and end up costing, untold millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases for these larger institutions. And I think, again, it goes back to people thinking of contact centers, call centers, frontline workers as cost centers rather than the people who could be the most enthusiastic advocates for your brand who are also directly interacting with your customers. So, in the book, I talk about the idea that I believe that there are only 3 types of experiences that you as a person ever have, whether it's one-to-one, one-to-many, whether you're listening to a podcast, whether you're talking to a human on the phone, whether you're answering an email. At the end of every single one of those interactions, you're going to feel only one of 3 ways: better, worse, or exactly the same. And we like to complicate things and look for all kinds of ways to measure things and track metrics. But if you say, I'm going to hire a team of people whose only job it is to not just resolve a customer's problem, but to leave that customer better than I found them, you are going to create advocates. And to your point, when you've got somebody who's only mildly frustrated and they want to call and get help resolving some issue with your brand, and then they spend 15 minutes either trying to find a phone number to talk to a human or interacting with a chatbot that's of absolutely no use at all. Now you've got someone who is incredibly frustrated because now not only have you failed them a first time with whatever the issue is, but you failed them again and it feels exponentially worse. And it's so much easier for those customers to say I'm done, I'm over it, I'm never shopping with this company or I'm never doing business with this company again.
So just one follow-up to that.
Mm-hmm.
I had an experience where I needed to bury some phone lines in my backyard, right? So I made that decision to bury the phone lines. So I needed to call the phone company. And there is no phone number to call the phone company on the website. And I finally found a number, like I was Columbo, and I said to the woman, what is the logic? You're a phone company, and I can't find a phone number. So this is a big phone it's a gigantic company. There's got to be smart people there who know they're just every day frustrating hundreds of thousands of people.
That is the height of irony. Yes, that you couldn't find a phone number for a phone company, but it happens all the time. And this is why I say everything is experience. Every interaction, every choice you make is saying something to your customers and your employees, something that's almost as silly as a phone company without a phone number on their website. There is a paint store about a mile from my house. It's a Sherwin-Williams store. And we were remodeling the bathroom a few months ago. And I said to my husband, like, oh, I'm going to go to Home Depot and pick out some paint. And he said, why are you going to Home Depot? It's 20 minutes away. There's a paint store a mile away. And I said, babe, that store has been closed for like 3 years. Like they never opened after COVID. And he said, I drive by there every day, Britt. They're open. And I was like, they are not. And I got in the store, I got in my car and drove to the store because I was like convinced that I was right. And, wanted to be able to say like, see, they've been closed. And they were open. But the reason I thought they were closed is because they're in a building that looks like it hasn't been painted in 15 years with like the most peeling, horrible sun damaged sign out by the road that you've ever seen. And I just had to laugh because I was like, you're a paint store. Like you have one job. You do one thing, Sherwin-Williams, like maybe paint your building, maybe paint your sign.
So Brittany, and I'm going to put my customer hat on, and maybe I'll make Mike laugh on this one, but I had a negative experience with a very large, well-known financial services company some 25, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And literally to this day, that company is not allowed in my offices. I didn't think we were treated well. Our clients weren't treated well some 25, 30 years ago. And I think occasionally of the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business that they've lost over all these years. Why don't these companies just get it? I don't understand. This seems like such common sense. Treat your customer right.
Yeah, it's all about, the people who don't see the forest for the trees. And not only has that company lost countless untold millions of dollars from you and your clients, but I bet you've told a bunch of people about that over the past quarter century or so. And I bet there are people who were influenced by what you said. And now they would never dream of working with that corporation either, because their only point of reference is a horror story from someone they trust.
So Brittany, his exact quote is, "They're dead to us." That's his exact quote.
Yes, I think, and it's funny because the principles there today are not even the principles that were there 25, 30 years ago. But that's how I'm adamant. If you don't work with and are a high ethical company, then we should not be doing business with you. We should not bring you into our family and the commitment that we have to our clients. If you're not high integrity company, you should not be part of our family.
Oh, 100%. And customers have long memories. And this is true across every category. We have long memories. So I question for you, when you had your first bad experience with that company, did you tell them and give them the opportunity to fix it, or did you? Yeah,
and I think, I kind of, and we try to really educate our own employees, right? Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody screws something up. I mean, that's just life, right? Stuff happens. It's how you fix it that makes all the difference in the world. Right? If you sweep it under the carpet, you ignore it, you ignore the client and their issues and their complaints, then it just festers and gets worse, right? But own up to it. Hey, there was a problem, there was a mistake, and this is how we're going to fix it going forward. 99 times out of 100, the client goes, thank you. I appreciate you working on it. I appreciate you acknowledging that there was a problem. Thank you for fixing it. And I think that's a positive to your example of, does the client walk away with a positive experience, a negative experience, or neutral? Even in a bad situation, we would hope the client walks away with a positive experience. We fixed it and we fixed it quickly.
Yes. And so the reason I asked that question is there's been a lot of research done over the past several decades around something that was the term coined in the 90s was service recovery paradox. And what was originally found to be true and what has since been proven again and again is that when a customer has a negative experience with a brand and they give them the opportunity to fix it and it is resolved, they become more loyal and over time spend more money and refer more customers than a customer who never had anything go wrong in the first place. And the reason is because most customers in most professions do not expect you to be perfect. Obviously, there are professions where perfection is the standard. Like if you are a, I don't know, pilot or a brain surgeon, like yes, perfection is what we all want all the time. But in most instances, people are reasonable. They're not expecting you to be perfect. They're expecting you to work really hard for them, to try your best, and most importantly, to fix things when things go wrong. So when you have the opportunity to do that, to actually fix something that went wrong, then the customer says, wow, they care about me. They did this for me. They did the right thing. And they feel more of a connection, both to that employee who helped them out and usually also to the organization at large. So that service recovery is a hugely important part of customer retention and employee retention. And there's a whole chapter about that in my book.
So Brittany, the examples that we talked about in the last few minutes were publicly traded companies that Dominick and I can or cannot invest in for our clients.
Mhm.
How big a megaphone do you need to get through to these gigantic companies? Is there an army of Brittany Hodaks out there and consultants who try to get through to these big companies, or is it impossible to break through to these giant bureaucracies and they have to figure it out on their own sometimes?
I would say both are true. There just as there are all kinds of people, there are all kinds of leaders and creating all kinds of companies as a result. And I would argue that certainly the smartest and the best leaders have figured this out. And again, if you look at some of the companies that are known to be service leaders at every price category, like this is not just about luxury products. I know a lot of people listening to this show probably are dealing with large financial institutions and have incredible means, and that's great. But the same principles apply at every single price point across every single category. And while some companies have figured it out, other companies continue to incentivize their leadership and their employees to make stupid decisions based on short-term, market trends of saying like, oh, we're going to do this because we've got to get this much revenue by the end of the quarter, not thinking about that revenue that you got this quarter is going to cost you 3x or 5x or 100x over the next 5 years because you've just angered a bunch of customers or you've just disenfranchised a bunch of employees. So when you don't have alignment between the goals and the rewards for people at the top of the company with your employees and your customers, you're setting yourself up for a disaster. It may not be this quarter, it may not even be this year, but man, it is coming. And I think too many people are like, oh, like the next CEO can worry about that. Like, oh, it's okay. I'm still getting my $48 million bonus this year or whatever, versus the ones who take a long-term approach to say, I'm the steward of this company. I'm the steward of this brand. I'm going to set the example for customer centricity. And we're going to always do the right thing for our team and for our customers, even if it means the stock price is going to trade a little bit lower for the next 2 months while we make this very important investment or, whatever the thing is that needs to be done. That is the right thing to do, even if sometimes it's the difficult thing to do.
And Brittany, to your point, there are many very large Fortune 500 companies today that even though the old management is gone and they've been terminated and fired and replaced, new management decades later is still trying to figure out how to get that reputational risk restored and get that customer confidence back to where it was. So just getting rid of the old management, replacing it, that's still a really long road for these companies to recovery.
Yeah, customers have long memories. And I mean, it's true on a large scale. It's true on a small scale as well. Like I still remember the companies that, like when I was 7 years old, my dad went to go try to buy a lawnmower at Sears and they wouldn't sell it to him because it was the display model. And he was like, right, but you sell them and charge an assembly fee. Why can't you just let me take this one and then assemble the new one that you get tomorrow? And they were like, oh, that's against the protocol. And he was like, right, but if I don't mow my yard today, I'm not going to get to mow my yard for a week. Like, can you please sell me this lawnmower? And they were like, sorry, sir, we can't do it. My dad was so mad. He was polite and he was like, we're leaving. On the way to the car, he was like, Brittany, we're never shopping at Sears ever again. They don't want our money. We're not going to give it to them. My mom had to cut up her Sears card. We couldn't get the catalog anymore. I don't know how much money they lost from the Jones family over the next few decades. And I don't know if I can directly tie that to their Chapter 11. But what I can tell you is that I think
your family not shopping there ever again. And you can add line probably led to their demise.
I think it was probably a direct A to B. Yeah, I think they
And,
might
and
have
I'm joking,
referred
but
to
it was customer service. They really had issues with customer service.
Yeah, and my dad was a customer service manager, so he's the one who helped me fall in love with this when I was a kid, without me knowing that I was doing it at the time. But he managed a restaurant for a long time, and then he was a customer service manager at a car dealership. And as a kid, watching the way he interacted with customers and hearing stories from customers about something that he had done for them that turned their day around, or sometimes their weeks, their months, their years around, was really, really impactful for me, and really drove home that message that when you put people first, those relationships will last. People can tell when they feel valued, and they're going to continue to be loyal to you because you were loyal to them.
So Brittany, we're running out of time, and I kind of want to ask, I think a question I asked earlier, kind of in a different way. I'm getting, sick and tired of hearing the word woke and what it means and what it doesn't mean. But politicians and broadcasters are quick to label a company and quick to make it a dirty word, right? So again, if you're trying to manage a brand, do you maneuver your way around, trying to do the right thing, but not being labeled in a way that you might be perceived to alienating a large chunk of your customer base?
Well, a couple things. I think one is realizing that the comments in your Twitter feed or the comments that you're seeing online from people do not equate to what your customers think and feel. Like, we know that there is a very, very vocal minority of people who want to make a lot of noise on Twitter, or make a lot of noise on the TV opinion talk shows at night. Separating those two things and knowing that just because, some pundit is dragging you for a minute right now, that might not actually be reflective of reality. So making sure that you are actually listening to your customers and your employees. The other thing that I would say is making a decision of whether or not you want to wade into those waters needs to be in alignment with who you are as a brand and what you stand for. I think an example of something that was totally stupid and made no sense was the whole M&M thing, right? I think M&M probably in Mars got unfairly dragged when they said orange has anxiety, or green couldn't wear high heels anymore. That is stupid. Whoever the brand manager is should have, not said any of that. But again, they have misaligned goals, because they're probably saying our job is to get the most PR impressions, or our job is to get people to talk about us. I would argue that there's probably zero correlation between what Tucker Carlson says about M&Ms and how much people buy M&Ms at grocery stores. I think that's a whole other topic we can get into of when it matters or when it doesn't. So those silly examples aside, the more legitimate, I would say, examples of things like social justice, or, reform of important issues, or things like, Roe v. Wade. It is up to every company to decide if they want to take a stance on those issues. And this is not a cop-out answer to say there is really no right answer, because the same way that every single person has to make a decision about how they feel and how vocal they want to be about certain things, every company has to make that decision. And that decision should be in alignment with the core values and the purpose of that company. So there are plenty of companies who've been quiet about things until it's been an issue that's directly impacted them. If you look at Walmart and gun control, for example, Walmart for a while was very, they didn't say a lot. I don't want to say they were silent, but they didn't find it as an issue. And then they started having mass shootings at Walmart stores. And so they said, okay, we're going to not sell AR-15s anymore. Okay, we're going to make it a little bit harder for somebody to go in and get a gun. Okay, we're going to, do this and this with our licensing regulations. So I think sometimes the answer is really clear when there's a direct correlation between something that's happening and your business, like the Walmart example. Other times it's makes no sense, like the whole M&M thing. And then you've got that messy, meaty middle where most of the people live, where you've got to decide, do I care enough about this issue to make a stance and, potentially alienate some of my customers or even my employees? And if it is important enough for you to go on the record to say, even if we lose some people, those are the wrong people, and it's more important for us to keep the right people internally and externally, that's when you say something. And if you're oh, this is just the flavor of the week, culture wars are going to be moving on to something else in a week or 2 weeks or a month anyway, like maybe don't try to like get the news cycle by tweeting or having some sort of hot take about those types of things.
Yeah, Brittany, I'm going to bring up one last quick point. 30 years ago, we used to call these companies socially responsible. And all that meant is that they treated the environment well, they treated their employees well, they treated their customers well, and the company did well, right? Putting all these political labels aside, whether it's ESG or woke, I think that confuses the issue, especially as an investor. You want a company that treats the environment well, treats its employees well, treats its customers well. And that company, according to your numbers, where we started this whole conversation today, the company's profits will do well. The company over the long run will perform well.
They will perform well. And, whether you're a CEO or somebody lower down on the org chart, it is always to say, you know what? I feel like there are people who are more qualified to share an opinion on that issue. So I'm going to stay in my lane and just continue to say my job is to make the best product possible and treat my employees the best way possible. But thank you for asking, and move on. Like, it's also okay to politely say, like, yeah, we don't have to make a comment on transgender bathrooms because we make tires. Like, you can pick and choose.
Brittany, Dominick and I every week thrive or strive, I should say, having a common sense conversation. And we appreciate you bringing a common sense and very logical and calm explanations to our questions tonight.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys having me here. I am obsessed with customer experience. So I'm always glad when I get to have a conversation about it, especially with people as fun as you guys, Mike and Dom.
So one last thing before we let you go, because we are running out of time, please tell people how they could get your book.
You can get my book, Creating Superfans, everywhere books are sold. The hardcover is available at independent bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and of course, Amazon.com. You can also find the Audible version that I narrate and the ebook at Amazon. So however you want to read it, I hope you enjoy it. And I promise it will help you make your team more customer-centric and turn some of those customers into superfans.
Well,
Thank you.
You did a great job tonight. Actually, we went right through the last break, and we're just Dom, we're gonna close out the show. We're basically out of time.
We'll have plenty to talk about next week, and not a bad way to close the show, Mike. Not a bad way at all.
Not at all. So, Brittany, you're going to join us in closing the show, and we appreciate you being on this evening.
I appreciate you having me.
Have a good night, everybody.